It's a pleasure to have with us today Daphna Kaufman. Daphna is an independent consultant and a researcher who specializes in progressive discourse in the United States. It's funny because last time I spoke with Daphna, I asked her about what's going on in Israel, and she goes, "I really actually, even though she lives in Israel, she knew a lot more about what was happening in the United States than almost anybody does." So, and I think that Daphna, you bring this sort of keen eye of somebody who's from this country, grew up in this country, but also can see it from afar at the same time, which I think is really an important capacity. And so I'm really glad we can discuss this today. I have to say that we talked before, and one thing that strikes me is we agree on a lot, but we also disagree on some issues, particularly how to tactically deal with it. And I think I'd like to sort of delve into some of that. So appreciate you being with us.
Happy to be here, and always fun to pick up the conversation. Absolutely. It evolves every time.
It does evolve every time. So, Daphna, you're paying a lot of attention to the progressive discourse in the U.S. How would you characterize its evolution in the past couple of years?
Well, we've certainly seen an intensification and increased influence and mainstreaming. I think that is very, very evident and documented in policy circles, and really in the rise of these informal networks, which are so powerful in progressive circles and in this intensely polarized and decentralized environment have really gained power. And what I look at a lot is the way that underlying ideological frameworks, ways of seeing the world have impacted discourse, and in doing so are influencing the broader left.
So you've popularized the term erasive anti-Semitism, referring to progressive discourse. Could you explain what that is, what you mean by that?
Sure. It talks about a kind of conceptual clash that occurs when these categories that are prevalent in contemporary progressive thought, that are presented in a binary way, oppressed and oppressor, along the lines of skin color, and also kind of approach to change, establishment, not establishment. When these are applied in a extremely binary, in a uniform way, something happens when that meets the lived Jewish experience and identity and vulnerability, which there is an exceptionality to the Jewish story, which kind of especially defies this kind of rigid categorization. So when these two meet, a negation or an erasure can occur wherein kind of because of the specific dynamics of this phenomenon, once you're designated into the white oppressor establishment category, your voice is, subsequently not centered or diminished. And in effect, this kind of feedback loop can result in an undermining of the Jewish voice in advocating for pro-Israel agendas and for Jewish communal agendas as well. And that's the main threat.
So one thought or critique one might have of this idea is that it seems to stipulate, tell me if I'm wrong here, seems to stipulate that this binary actually holds but for the Jews. And there, because Jews are exceptional and have their own unique story, it doesn't really work. Where some of us might say the entire binary is problematic. The entire binary actually creates this kind of unique bigotry because it's not true even in describing other communities, or it's not as comprehensive and precise as it needs to be about racial dynamics in general. What are your thoughts about that?
So, there's not any clear one central text to kind of purse the answer to that question. The way I see it is that there is a spectrum within contemporary progressive discourse. And I'm not specifically talking about academic theories, but specifically on the discourse as I see it. And within that spectrum, there is this binary application, which I would agree with what you said. I think that that's an exclusionary way to hold as an exclusive prism. And on the other end, there's the sensitizing lens application where, okay, there are certain voices that have been systemically undermined let's ensure that these institutions that still reflect some inherent biases or some long established biases are especially sensitive also to this lens. And I mean, I don't think that there is a definitive answer to whether there is a core motivating force of progressive ideology that inherently leads to only binary, rigid, exclusionary applications. I don't know the answer to that, but I also don't think beyond me it's been definitively. And in these extremely polarizing times that we're in, I take an approach that is more acknowledging of the spectrum and the nuance. I don't think there's any contradiction to calling out the binary applications that are exclusionary, not only to Jews, but I would say Jews have a special kind of, because of the uniqueness of the Jewish experience, at once powerful and vulnerable to this, these catastrophic lows. But I think the question is, what are you attacking? Just that, or does it necessarily mean defining all, critical race perspectives as destructive?
So I think we agree on that point, that critical race perspectives are not necessarily destructive. It's a theoretical lens that one can bring to the world in a systems level approach where one can see certain social dynamics that one might otherwise be blind to, and it's important lens to have. And the question is, to what degree is that really ever in this today and age deployed merely as a theoretical lens? And that's really where I think maybe we don't entirely see eye to eye on, because I think that's rare. I wish it weren't rare. If it were rare, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. If that were the prevalent paradigm, I would be signed up. But because I feel precisely that lens, that theoretical lens, is combined with what's sometimes referred to as standpoint epistemology, this idea that only those with the proper lived experience are qualified to define race and racism and bigotry for the rest of society, because it's packaged that way so frequently, it's then typically weaponized in a way that says it gives the systems level approach, but then it establishes its own truth and inviolability. And to me, that's where we get into a problem. Now, the question is it how should we talk about it? In other words, we agree there's a spectrum. There's no question about that. But I had a professor who once said, critical knowledge requires two faculties, not one. The ability to make distinctions for sure, but also the ability to make good generalizations. And the question is this a good generalization or not? To talk about critical social justice as a suite of related ideologies united in their certainty and of how they do analysis.
So, as to the different ways that I do see it manifesting in more of a, more of a soft way, I see, in across generations, the effect of the movement that has included in its underpinnings critical theories. I do see a greatly expanding consciousness where there wasn't about race issues. Mm-hmm. And there are many examples that you can point to that are abuses thereof, and they're easy to point to. but like the incremental, the slowly creeping paradigm change in considering as integral, as an issue, getting perspectives of others. And of course, we're in agreement that when that's only X's perspective is important and Y's should be discounted, there a big problem begins. But looking at more incremental change across discourse, I think, whatever wokeness or the has ushered in a lot of positive change. And I think that brings a responsibility to call out its abuses, the extreme manifestations, and to have public and intellectual discussions, and to call out, in terms of both strategy and positioning in a deeper sense. And if I'm, speaking more from like the perspective of Jewish communal, there are problems with a wholesale rejection that doesn't acknowledge the spectrum. And in general, I think that the idea should be, and again, this is from I think that there is extremely valuable work in critically discussing the contemporary discourse. I think the urgent mission for Jewish communities is to assert the right to reclaim the Jewish narrative, even when it doesn't fit these binary categorizations, to challenge where this discourse applies that kind of rigidity from a Jewish lens, in seeking to make a more inclusive, progressive discourse by reflecting the Jewish experience within it, asserting the right to claim that narrative.
Right. I want to go back to that, because I think that might be another sort of point of subtle divergence between the two of us, because it's not that I don't agree with that to a degree. It's just that if progressive discourse has become, like I've been suggesting, more of a monopoly than it is just a sort of range of theories and perspectives, then to me, the central task is not to reclaim the Jewish narrative in it, but rather to fight for liberalism. And I think there's an inflection point where I actually used to be where you are, and no longer, because I felt like the discourse has become so toxic, so regressive. And again, I'm not saying that there's no counter examples to it. I just don't see a lot of them anymore. That the dominant discourse now has sort of crowded out those sort of more mild, moderate, thoughtful, nuanced voices. But I want to come back to that in 1 second. But I want to just sort of apply a case study here and get your thoughts on it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of debate in the U.S., and I know you're a keen observer of this, and sort of
I didn't hear the first part of the question. I had a freeze on my end. I heard until you were you come from the U.S. or your experience in the U.S. and then
right. Okay, so we'll have to edit there. Okay, so and I'm back, right?
Yes.
Okay, so so what I'm arguing, I just want to make sure I'm on the best possible internet here. I didn't get booted off. Okay, I didn't. Okay, so let's see where what I'm arguing here is that the discourse has become so toxic, so regressive, and that the dominant forms, the more aggressive forms, have crowded out the more nuanced forms. And so therefore, there's an inflection point, a strategic inflection point that I've at least crossed, that says our central task is no longer to assert the Jewish narrative within the progressive discourse, but rather to fight for liberalism itself and liberal values, because we're not going to be successful very often in the progressive circles. It's just become too constricted. We'll return to that in a minute. I want to talk about it, but I wanted to apply a case study for a second. So you're a keen observer of what's going on in America around the issue of critical race theory in education, and and let's leave aside the very explosive term critical race theory or CRT and say there are people who believe that kids should be taught precisely how structural racism perpetuates disparities in American society. And some would call that critical race theory. Let's leave aside whether that's the right term or not. And I would argue that actually, while I'm perfectly willing to debate and think about and struggle with where systemic racism exists and where it doesn't exist, I don't want a single interpretation of how our social dynamics function. I want to be able to debate whether or not Flint, Michigan's water problem was a function of systemic racism or was it something else? I want to be able to look at these problems, including the criminal justice system, which I have a lot of problem with. I want to be able to look at it and decide for myself or in debate and conversation with others about whether or not it's defined by systemic racism or whether it's something else or a series of factors that might be interrelated. And to me, that's where the problem is now, that an insistence on a single explanation for disparity. What's your take on that? Am I wrong about that?
I think that's exactly where we're aligned. I think that's a problem, and I think there's, I think that there is a vigorous debate that's been really broadening and mainstreaming exactly about these questions. I think these questions are less than ever hushed up and more than ever front and central. And the case studies that you described, I see the same way as you. The difference between us is my view of the spectrum and acknowledgement of the sensitization that has brought positive and much needed corrective value to the society.
Right. So I'm going to do more to do what you just did. I'm going to do more to acknowledge how an appreciation of systemic issues in our society can help is important. It was important because I do think that is true, and I think it would be easier for people to hear us the more we do it. I do say it, and I do write about it, but it sometimes gets lost in translation. And but I think you're right. I think you're right about that. I mean, I would have. But I'm just not sure it's that prevalent right now.
Not just as a matter of more effective engagement, but as a matter of what is the end result that you seek and who and what exactly is the target. I would very narrowly define it as this rigid and binary application and be very careful about not overstepping that definitional boundary.
Right. Yeah. When we've been using the term critical social justice ideology as sort of this suite of ideologies. We talk about imposing critical social justice ideology. We don't even just talk about critical social justice ideology. It's the imposition of this ideology, which holds that one, that bias exists in systems and not just individuals, and two, that only those with lived experience or who have been adversely affected by those systems have the insights to see it. And it's only that package that actually becomes problematic and that seeks to sort of stifle conversation. But and then there's then the question is, given our limited, scarce resources as a Jewish community, should the emphasis still be, as Reut and you, when you were working with them on it, said, I think it was 2009 or 2010 when you wrote about delegitimization of Israel, should the emphasis be on trying to influence those systems of thought from within? Or should we say, that's no longer working well. The ideology is just too ubiquitous, too problematic, and we should now start to fight the ideological underpinnings themselves? What should be the lion's share, the emphasis of our strategy?
So, I do think there are a lot of parallels with the Reut strategy, because I think that the ideological, hard progressive left, to which the binary definition is an absolute truth, etc., I don't think that that's an area to penetrate. I don't frame it strategically as which ideology to attack, but or which ideology to engage with, but the people. And people, I mean, except for the hard extreme side, don't identify one-on-one with a given ideology. They're influenced by discourse. And
Yeah.
the same people that are influenced by discourse, and to me, that's, the broader left, and I'm discluding the hard ideological progressive left. That's still where the heart of the issue is.
Right, but I would argue that there's sort of, you define the hard ideological left, and then sort of people who are sort of influenced by the discourse. But there's sort of a third camp that I'm very interested in, which is there are people who are sort of, I would argue, sort of woke ideologues. They're not arguing that we should like tear apart our civilization. They're not arguing that that whiteness needs to be dismantled, let's say, in that way, but they are embracing sort of a DEI perspective, like which holds that that really there's only one acceptable explanation for disparity, and they like the Kennedy's book How to Be an Anti-Racist, and they talk about white fragility. They mean very well. They're not trying to shut down discourse. They don't know that that's in effect what they might be doing when people who disagree with them feel put off or shunted aside. But that's in effect what they're doing, and I feel like that has to be challenged, because a large swath of the Jewish community is actually doing just that right now.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it is, as these excesses become more mainstream, there is more of a counter reaction, and I think the Jewish voice is valuable in some hats on a broader defense of liberal values, in some that represent the Jewish communal experience, doing that which may not be any less effective because of how specifically it affects, and what an authentic reflection of that could kind of rupture in the purity of the ideology. But though, there are areas which it seems that there are an abundance of egregious examples of exactly what, you and I have both, said is a destructive ideology. And there's no disagreement on the need to challenge that.
Okay, so let's go back to sort of the possibility that Jews still need to be in the progressive game, and we need to be influencing progressive discourse and helping, with a more nuanced understanding of Jews in Israel and the like. So in other words, we want our core institutions in the Jewish community to continue to engage in progressive spaces, and move them in our direction sort of more incrementally. Do you feel that that the current ideological environment still allows that in the same way that maybe both of us would have agreed to 10 years ago?
So, when, in terms of the broader question of where Jewish communal organizations should engage, they need to reflect Jewish communities, and Jewish communities are very attached to progressive values, and have been, in many cases, through great upheavals in recent months and even in recent years, in encountering anti-Semitism from the left for the first time for many of them, because it's been such a highly activist, engaging environment, and this friction has occurred. So for Jewish communal organizations, regardless of the values or political inclinations, to be absent from that, I think is not tenable.
Right. Well, there's still a matter of how you use resources. So, you're in a Jewish community that is mostly liberal. You're in a community, a city that is, let's say, majority liberal, as most cities are, most urban areas are. And you have to make some decisions, strategic decisions about how to deploy your resources. And the question I have, are you going to deploy the lion's share of your scarce community relations resources in engaging progressives in order to move them further in your direction? Or are you going to say, that's not working very well anymore, and it's time for us to start to fashion a new coalition that's maybe more center left, center right. You're really not targeting the fence sitters on BDS as much anymore. You're targeting people who are already inclined to agree with you, especially on issues of liberalism and want to live in a liberal society. And you're trying to say, this is the new positioning of the Jewish community, given this very ideologically polarized society that we're living in. To me, that's where the strategic discussion, and I'm not saying, I realize I don't want to make that into a complete binary myself, as if one has to completely choose one or the other, although I think there's a tension between those two, but rather how we deploy our resources and where we deploy the majority of them.
So I think, again, I also would not deploy resources at targeting the hard ideological progressive left. In terms of the how on this issue, I don't know if the relevant question is what the declared goal and formal meetings that a handful of Jewish executives undertake to pursue an agenda. I think it's a question of a real mobilization that is adapted to the activist, decentralized, network-oriented influence we are in. It's a question of harnessing authentic voices, of framing a broader mission of standing up for Jewish narrative self-determination, and beginning to empower the people that are already there to make these conversations personal and occurring on multiple levels, because I don't think that there is a systemic change that is feasible with declarative or solely high-level engagement on this issue, whether you frame it as a broader struggle and look at the whole ideology, or apply a more narrow lens.
But to push back just a little bit, when Reut issued its delegitimization paper, it was highly influential. I mean, maybe not immediately, but if you looked at it over a course of a couple of years, first of all, you renamed the new anti-Semitism to delegitimization, which was a better, more apt way of looking at the challenge. You talked about building a firewall between the far left and the moderate left. And it became a strategy that I think ultimately took hold in many mainstream Jewish circles over time. It became the dominant strategy of community relations, in part because I think people recognized the challenge on their own over time, but in part because you set some new ways of thinking in motion. And I guess what I'm arguing is it's time to set some new ways of thinking in motion on whether or not that's should be the dominant strategy, or whether or not we should rethink it. Again, it won't be immediate. It's not going to be comprehensive. Not everyone will buy in just because a couple people think it's a good idea, but over time, if it's a good argument, if it's made by enough of the right people, we could see, I would think, a strategic shift in a certain direction. The question is that the right strategic shift?
So released in the last few weeks a paper that I lead authored that talks exactly about an analysis of the evolving nature of the threat, because it's not the delegitimization threat. It's not distinct from it. It overlaps in many ways.
Yes,
but it is an evolved threat, and talks about kind of strategic approaches, and again through a Jewish communal organization lens, which doesn't negate the need for varied and diverse instruments in the orchestra. So that lens is really a very specific statement about a specific role. But I think it's very important to recognize that the delegitimization threat was characterized really in terms of the threat it posed to Israel's fundamental legitimacy. And now we see something that is also extremely vital in terms of pro-Israel agendas, but is also increasingly undermining Jewish and Jewish communal voices on the left. And these the manifestations of the threat are different, but they evolve from the same root of this conceptual clash and of the disempowering the disempowerment of the ability to voice Jewish or pro-Israel agendas, kind of given the designations that are prevalent in contemporary progressive discourse. So it's the same source of the problem, but now it's not just Israel, and that is complex and also changes the game strategically.
Right. And I'm thinking out loud here. I sometimes wonder if we really should even be talking about BDS and delegitimization as much as we should. What does it mean to support a liberal society, a society that respects democracy and liberal values, and if that becomes our center of gravity, then we're not talking so much about people on the far-flung left who continue to try to delegitimize Israel. We're talking about strengthening our allyship with people who would never even consider viewing Israel as a colonial power or something like that. But I still think a lot about these issues. Part of it is, to what degree do I favor sort of a multi-instrument orchestra approach, or what degree do I favor us moving really to a few key instruments, and not that I'd be able to set it. We'll be divorced whether I think it's a good idea or not. It's just the nature of a community. But I do think but it might dictate the kind of arguments that we would make. Are there other ways that you're looking at this sort of ideological moment? Are there other things, you've written a lot about it. Are there other key findings that you have about what this means for the Jewish community or for liberal democracy in general in the long term?
So in terms, again, of the kind of dilemma about the type of response, the nature of the response to take, for me, it's always extremely focal when I kind of zoom out, the overall chaos, of the broader societal moment that we find ourselves in. Yeah. And in chaotic states, when dealing with complex systems, an approach of probing, of not kind of barreling through with one particular, but looking at the different directions and doing a lot of learning, I think characterizes this state that we find ourselves in. And that's part of my reluctance to wholeheartedly take, and the absolutism is exactly the kind of symptom of the broader societal symptoms that are responsible for the problem that we're discussing.
Right. Here's where it's fascinating, because look, I obviously agree with you. I want to live in a liberal society where people can debate ideas. I'm willing to hear out people who support all kinds of policies that I think are wrong, and even anti-Israel policies or ideas that I don't particularly like. And I guess this is really another key question, is in some ways, if I'm right that this ideology has reached such a fevered pitch and has become so dominant in our institutions, then I would think that it's not enough just to approach this with an open mind and a spirit of inquiry, but they have to fight it, right? I mean, at some point there are ideas that come across out in societies, and maybe we're not accustomed to them in democratic societies like the United States, that just require you to say, I'm sorry, but no. and I'm going to fight this, and not because I want to fight them. I'm looking for a fight with. I'd much rather make love than war. But if I don't feel that that's going to work anymore, I feel so far gone that I have to fight now because, or else we'll lose, or we're standing to lose more than we already have. Then maybe you have to do that.
We're aligned on the need to fight the kinds of examples that, those to me are the egregious examples that were on the exact same page. So that's, so on that. And then the question is whether the whole, like the Jewish communal kind of ecosystem should be focused on the what exactly, right? The abuses of critical race theory or
On the right, by the way, and neoliberalism on the right.
But
and neoliberalism on the right? You could say I'm, we are strongly opposed and very nervous about examples of a liberalism on both political streams that are expressing themselves in different ways. I mean, there are people who would say the Republican Party has been, a whole entire political party has been taken over by a populist force that's inimical to our interests and values. Not everybody would agree with that, but that's an argument. And there are others who would say that the key institutions of the left, not the Democratic Party at this point, but key institutions of the left or of mainstream society, even corporations and cultural institutions like symphonies and poetry societies and scientific institutions like journals like the Lancet or medical schools and others, that they have been, in a sense, captured and that they no longer have the ability to allow liberal conversations around these issues. And I guess that's really, and maybe this is, I don't know if my lived experience here matters, but I'm feeling that on an everyday basis. When I see some, friends who are involved in like the human services sector, and they have sessions on decolonizing data that is mandatory for every employee. I mean, it's sort of immersed. Every single institution seems immersed in this discourse right now. And I don't see it as the kind of the more nuanced version that you're talking about. And so I guess I'm saying for the Jewish ecosystem, at what point do you say we have problems on both the left and the right that we have to fight, and we have to rethink our positioning in American society in some fundamental sense?
Yeah, I wouldn't see that as that kind of a statement as at all problematic. I'm not sure exactly what reconsidering positioning, if it means taking an active stance on the status of Jews on the progressive and broader left. Yes, I mean that is that's what we're discussing. And there is a question that's strategic about how to engage in that, how to frame and through what lens.
Yeah, I think that's
and
right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate this conversation. I always do, because I think you're somebody who obviously spends a lot of time thinking about these issues and has for a long time, and from a slightly different vantage point, from a slightly different place. And it's nice to be able to sort of compare notes and see where we end up. And I hope we can continue this conversation.
Happy to. Thank you so much.